This isn't just drama, it's a story to learn from. Don't repeat their mistakes. Watch with an open heart.
She was laughing when it happened. Clara said it was one of those overly choreographed reception moments. Brunch food, vintage string quartet playing a pop song in disguise, everyone a little too polished for real joy. My ex-wife had just thrown her head back in that curated way she always did for attention when one of his groomsmen leaned across the table, didn't raise his voice, didn't smirk, just asked her, casually, like he was reading a wine label, "So, does he know he was always the stand-in?" Clara told me the laugh stopped mid-note, like a glass cut in half. She said my ex froze with her mouth still open, hand tightening around the stem of a champagne flute. Her new husband, tall, loud, the kind who brags about his shoe collection, was off taking selfies with the caterer or some cousin. He didn't hear it, but Clara did. And then she watched my ex's eyes flick to the groomsman, then back to her plate like she was trying to unhear it. "You should have seen her face," Clara whispered into the voice message. "She looked like someone had dropped a spider in her dress." I played the message twice. Once while making coffee, again while standing barefoot at the window, sun bleeding in over Lisbon rooftops. I hadn't asked for it, hadn't expected it, but I also hadn't needed more than that one line, because it confirmed something I'd carried quietly for months. Not bitterness, just the cold shape of suspicion that even her so-called fresh start came wrapped in old lies. If you're still listening, and any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, hit like and subscribe. Most people just listen in silence, but that one click tells the team these stories matter. I didn't message Clara back. I didn't need to. She knew what that whisper meant. She knew it because I had once told her, long ago, the exact phrase I'd overheard my ex say on the phone when we were still married: "It doesn't matter who I marry. He was always the safer choice." She'd said it to someone she thought I'd never meet. I never confronted her with it. But I remembered. And now, here it was. Echoed back, years later, in a groomsman's careless question, asked not to wound, but because maybe, just maybe, he'd heard it too. I watched the message timestamp tick to 9:43 a.m., then I slid the phone into my pocket, walked to the small table where my coffee cooled, and picked up the photo she'd once mailed me from Paris. The one with the handwritten note, "You made me brave enough to dream. I didn't tear it up, I didn't burn it. I flipped it over, wrote today's date on the back, and placed it inside a drawer I rarely open, because some stories don't need a response, they just need a record." The first message came in just after midnight. Long, rambling, no greeting, no subject, just, "I don't know what Clara told you, but people love to stir up drama. It's pathetic, honestly." I didn't answer, just stared at the screen while the text bubble flickered, then disappeared. 10 minutes later, another one arrived. "This is exactly why I didn't want you at the wedding. You twist everything. You always made me feel like I was the problem." Still, I said nothing. Then came a third, shorter, colder. "You looked so desperate when you left." I read that line 3 times. The wording wasn't random. It was surgical, meant to sting. She wanted me to react, maybe apologize, maybe defend myself. But I'd learned something in the years since the split. Silence isn't surrender. It's insulation. I took a screenshot of each message one by one. Date, time, full display. Saved them to a backup folder I'd created the week after the divorce was finalized. A place I rarely touched, but always kept updated. It wasn't about revenge, it was about readiness. Because if she was reaching out after months of radio silence, it meant something on her side had slipped. Maybe the wedding wasn't the fairy tale she painted it to be. Maybe that whisper at the reception had spread. Maybe her new husband had noticed the way her laugh faltered when people brought up the past. Or maybe, just maybe, she had always imagined I'd still be waiting for her to change her mind, to call, to say, "I've been right, I wasn't." When I left the courthouse that last day, I did it with a quiet kind of clarity. No door left open, no phone kept just in case. I didn't leave my old life hoping she'd miss me. I left because I finally stopped missing the version of myself I had to become around her. Now here she was, the ink on her new last name barely dry and already trying to rewrite mine. The next morning I turned off message previews, changed the lock screen, moved the phone face down on the table. I didn't need more proof. The panic was in the pattern, and I'd seen it before. The ping lit up my screen while I was slicing into a ripe fig, the morning sun warming the windowsill. One notification, foreign deposit received. I wiped my hands on a towel, opened the app, and stared at the amount. Not large, $1,750, but the sender's name made me pause. A boutique hotel in Prague, one I'd never heard of. It took less than a minute to trace. The transfer came from a legacy trust we'd opened years ago, back when we still believed in the idea of someday. The kind meant to fund travel, property, or, ironically, life milestones. I'd mostly forgotten about it, tucked behind other portfolios and long-idle joint ventures. But she hadn't. She'd tapped it, likely assuming it had defaulted fully to her. What she forgot, or never knew, is that to access more than 20%, the agreement required dual post-divorce authorization, my signature, my release, and that hadn't happened. She must have glossed over the footnotes. Or maybe she'd relied on some junior advisor to comb through the details while she planned her second walk down the aisle. Either way, the clause held. I leaned back in the chair, phone resting beside my plate. All the mornings I'd spent brushing past that trust, assuming it would quietly close or be absorbed. And now here it was, humming with potential. It wasn't the money, it was what it signaled. She used my signature, my legacy, really, to help pay for her fresh start. Flowers, flights, deposits. Probably smiled while doing it, thinking I'd disappeared across the ocean and buried the past deep enough not to notice. But I noticed, and now I knew exactly where to look. I logged into the trust's dashboard. The permissions matrix was still active. Timestamps, disbursements, descriptions. Line by line, it all played out. Venue payment, floral retainer, a boutique hotel block in Prague labeled Honeymoon Suite, all logged under her authorization, none legally valid beyond the 20% threshold. She thought she'd built her new chapter cleanly, but she'd stitched it together with thread that still ran through my hands. I didn't touch the funds, not yet. I just downloaded the records, zipped them into a folder, and labeled it simply Shared Illusions. Then I poured myself another coffee, slower this time. The story she was writing was already cracking, and the paper trail was mine now. The box was plain. No return address, no markings, just a taped edge and a custom slip that only said personal items. It was waiting on the tile floor of my Lisbon apartment when I came back from the market, tucked beside my door like it had been placed gently rather than delivered. At first, I thought it might be a late birthday gift from someone who'd forgotten or pretended to forget what month it was. But the moment I opened the lid, that idea vanished. A velvet jewelry box sat at the top, slightly worn at the corners. I knew it before I touched it. The earrings, gold with a tiny twist of garnet. I'd had them custom made for our 10th anniversary. She'd cried when I gave them to her. Soft, shaking tears I'd once believed were real. I'd watched her wear them to galas, dinners, even lazy weekends when she wanted to feel beautiful. And now they were back in my hands. Beneath them sat a wedding program. Cream cardstock, black ink, their names in a serif font trying too hard to look timeless. The date was last week. And then, a letter. Still sealed. No handwriting. Just a printed name. Lauren Matthews. It took me a moment. Lauren. I'd met her once, years ago, during a conference her fiancé had attended with my ex. Back then, he was just a colleague from her regional team. Lauren had been kind, composed, a little too quiet. She'd complimented my shoes, asked where we were staying. I never thought of her again, until now. I sat down slowly, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. Opened it. Just so you know, she said the same things to me, word for word. That was the first line. No greeting, no build-up, just a blade, unsheathed. She told me she'd never felt seen before, that she didn't know love could feel like this, that what they had was different, sacred, like it had waited for them. The letter wasn't long, but each sentence landed like something heavy dropped in a quiet room. Lauren didn't write with venom. She wrote like someone filing a final report, cold, factual, done. She said those things while I was still his wife. We were in counseling. I believe we were rebuilding. He swore there was no one else. My breath caught. She told me once that her first marriage was a safety net, that she admired you, but that she couldn't breathe around you. She said I wouldn't understand unless I'd been trapped too. And then the last line, underlined lightly in pencil. She doesn't love people, she collects them. I read it twice, then folded the letter neatly and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I just sat there for a long time, watching the light crawl across the floor, touching the edges of the box, the earrings, the program. It wasn't just me. I hadn't been paranoid. I hadn't been fragile. I'd been next in line. And now, finally, I wasn't. His voice was too casual. Hi, this is Andrew Fuller, legal representative for Ms. Stanton, formerly Mrs. Calloway. I wanted to quickly touch base regarding a small clerical issue we've run into with one of the asset authorizations. Clerical issue. I let the phrase hang in the air like a bad perfume. He launched into his pitch before I had the chance to answer. Something about a minor error in the asset reporting sequence, something about a delay with the trust custodian's release form, something about how I might be willing to kindly reconsider the authorization so the remaining funds could be dispersed in a timely fashion. That phrase again, kindly reconsider, as if we were discussing a dinner reservation and not the bank that funded her new life. I said I'd look into it, just that, no tone, no edge. Then I ended the call. I already knew what he was talking about. 2 years ago, in the back office of a notary in Portland, I'd insisted on one clause being added to our trust amendment during the divorce asset renegotiations. She hadn't blinked when she signed it, probably too eager to rush out before traffic hit, but I had remembered every word. Funds disbursed for non-mutual use post-dissolution shall require joint notarization and post-dated co-signature within 30 days of final divorce decree. In plain terms, if she wanted more than the 20% base from that trust, if she wanted to use it for her second wedding or her honeymoon or her boutique wine bar launch, she needed me, not legally as her husband, but contractually as the original grantor and co-beneficiary. And I wasn't inclined. I found the scanned copy in my archives under a folder marked Legacy Freeze. Clean signature, clear clause, notarized and timestamped. I forwarded it directly to Andrew, no body text, just the attachment. Within 5 minutes, I saw the red receipt. Within 10, a second email came through. He asked for a call. I declined. I poured myself a glass of Vinho Verde and sat on the terrace, watching the clouds roll in over the Tagus River. The air smelled like distant rain and eucalyptus. Calm, steady. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about remembering what she forgot. I hadn't disappeared. I hadn't collapsed. I'd simply stepped out of the role she needed me to play and kept the paperwork. The account stayed locked, and so did the part of me that once wanted to make things easier for her. The photo came through while I was waiting for a train, light drizzle, platform humming, the soft static of overhead announcements I barely understood anymore. Clara's name lit up my screen, followed by a single line, "You might want to zoom in." It looked like a typical reception shot. Grouped guests in rented elegance, fake laughter frozen mid-frame, champagne flutes half full. My ex stood at the center, her hand on her new husband's chest, chin tilted, smile sharp. Clara was off to the side, waving at the camera with her usual lack of subtlety. But then I saw it, not in the crowd, behind them. Reflected in a wall mirror was the easel with the seating chart, a neatly printed layout of names and tables, the kind wedding planners love to charge extra for. In the reflection just above the glint of a chandelier, I spotted it. His name, her new husband, seated at table 3, right next to Michael Mendez. I hadn't thought of him in years. We met only once, briefly, during the due diligence meetings before a messy acquisition involving her old firm. He introduced himself as her mentor, smiled like a politician, and handed me a card with embossed lettering and no direct title. Back then, I'd chalked it up to corporate ego. She'd barely mentioned him, just said he was someone who helped guide her career. Now, seeing his name beside her husband's at the wedding table felt deliberate, too deliberate. I zoomed in. There was no mistake. He wasn't just attending. He was a primary guest, honored, seated within reach of the groom, not the bride, which meant one of two things. Either the new husband didn't know the full story behind that mentorship, or he knew and didn't care. I sat back on the bench as a train pulled in and left without me. My mind moved fast, years of dates, timelines, small confessions that hadn't seemed like confessions at the time. The late dinners, the trips to D.C. for executive briefings. The one weekend she said she needed to clear her head in Denver and came back with a branded pen and a story about solitude. Michael Mendez was always nearby, always background noise, and now he was seated beside the man who married her. I saved the photo, then pulled up the trust account records I'd archived the week prior, cross-referenced vendors, found a payment to a catering firm run by a shell company that, after 3 more clicks, listed Mendez's name as an executive advisor. Of course, it wasn't a triangle, it was a map, and now I was starting to draw the borders. I didn't text her, didn't email, didn't respond to the string of veiled jabs and passive-aggressive subtweets her friends had started posting, quotes about healing from silence, surviving narcissists, choosing chaos over comfort. I ignored them all, but when Clara forwarded the podcast promo, I paused. Up next, it said, in soft pastel script, Freedom After the Wrong Marriage, a candid conversation with Serena Calloway about finding yourself after years of pretending. Pretending. I reread the word 3 times. Not healing, not growth, pretending. That wasn't a story about her. That was a story about me. My name wasn't in the title, but it echoed in every implication, and I knew her well enough to guess what she'd say behind a filtered mic and a sympathetic host. She'd make herself the phoenix, I'd be the ash. What she didn't remember or never really read was the clause we'd both signed at the end of mediation in a room that smelled like printer ink and cold coffee. She was exhausted that day, eyes puffy, voice flat. She just wanted it over. So she signed everything, including the clause I'd insisted on keeping intact without redline edits. No mutual assets or public narratives may be rewritten in published material, digital or spoken, without mutual consent. She'd thought it was about memoirs or blogs. She never imagined I'd use it to stop a podcast, but I did. I printed the clause, 1 line, black ink, standard paper, and folded it into a blank envelope. No return address, no signature, just that 1 sentence. I mailed it to the podcast studio directly. No threat, no lawyer speak, just a simple reminder. The episode was pulled the next morning. No explanation, no replacement. The host posted a vague message about scheduling conflicts and mutual respect. She didn't try to reschedule. A few hours later, one of her friends posted a quote about censorship, another about men fearing powerful women with a voice, but none of them named me, and she never tried again. Not because I'd silenced her, but because she finally remembered I hadn't erased our story. I just stopped letting her rewrite it alone. The message came in while I was standing in line at the bakery, waiting on a warm bolo de arroz. Clara's tone was clipped, like she wasn't sure whether to laugh or whisper. She walked out, she said, middle of brunch, mid-toast, gone. I stepped out of line, letting someone else take my spot, and played the voice note again. Clara had been invited to the post-wedding brunch, small, intimate, curated. A select guest list of people who'd seen her through the hard times, and now, supposedly, her glow-up. They were toasting to new beginnings, Clara went on. Someone raised a glass and said, to Serena and the art of clean exits. Then another woman, you'd like her, no filter, asked, how'd you two manage the divorce so cleanly? Did you guys fight at all? I could almost picture it, the slow smile draining from Serena's face, her hand tightening around the stem of her mimosa, everyone watching. She didn't answer right away, Clara said. Then she said, he didn't fight, he just left. And then she stood up and excused herself. Clara paused. She didn't come back. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked down the alley to the quiet side street behind the bakery and sat on a sun-warmed bench. I watched a couple argue softly over parking instructions. A toddler in a blue hat trying to feed pigeons, life going on, gently, indifferent. She had crafted an entire narrative around how easy I made the split, that I'd just vanished, that she was the one left behind, picking up pieces of herself and building something better. But ease isn't the absence of pain. It's the choice not to perform it publicly. And now, that absence, the very silence she'd painted as weakness, was making people curious. Because the truth is, I didn't vanish. I documented, I remembered, I signed and notarized and copied and walked away with every clause intact. And in the absence of a scandal, People were starting to notice the gaps in her story, the missing struggle, the lack of bruises she couldn't explain. They were starting to realize that for someone who claimed to be the wrong party, she never actually had to fight, which meant maybe she wasn't the one who'd been betrayed, just the one who didn't get to rewrite the ending. The envelope was thin, no return address. My name printed in block letters, as if by someone trying to make it impersonal. No smudges, no perfume, no trace of warmth, just paper sealed tight and silent. I sat with it for an hour before opening it. There were no stamps from abroad. It had been mailed from somewhere nearby, a domestic drop maybe from a friend's hand to a quiet post office box. That alone told me everything I needed to know. She didn't want it traced, but she wanted it read. Inside a single folded page, notebook paper torn at the top, familiar loops in the handwriting, rushed and unfiltered. No salutation, just a date, 1 week after the brunch. And then the words. Maybe I was always chasing something that didn't need me back. That was it. No signature, no explanation, no story about who she was writing to, just the sentence, raw and exposed, a confession not meant to be shared, but too heavy to carry alone. I read it once, then again. There was something quietly tragic about it. Not the kind that demands sympathy, but the kind that lands like a stone at the bottom of a well. She hadn't tried to make herself right, hadn't blamed me or fate or timing. She hadn't even asked for a response. She just released it. I didn't tear it up, didn't call Clara, didn't let it pull me back into questions I'd already outgrown. Instead, I folded the paper and tucked it behind the inside flap of my passport. Not in a drawer, not in a journal, not even in the folder where I'd kept every legal piece of this unraveling. My passport felt right. Because I wasn't holding on. I was simply marking the moment, not her apology, not her redemption, just her reality, finally unfiltered, and mine, moving forward. The alert came in while I was reading on the balcony, warm breeze brushing past the linen curtains, the street below buzzing with lazy weekend chatter. Just a ping, routine, almost forgettable. Until I saw the number, $8,000, no notes, no references, just a deposit into my Lisbon account, originating from a business account I didn't recognize until I pulled the transaction metadata, a shell vendor tucked under a hospitality group, the same one that had processed the wedding venue. It was the exact amount she'd pulled from the legacy trust for that deposit, down to the cent. No fanfare, no apology, no forwarded message or attempt to dress it up with grace. Just money, returned like a rental item she no longer wanted associated with her name. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not out of shock, but because of what it wasn't. It wasn't a power play. It wasn't a gesture meant to draw me back in. It was just the end. Quiet and clean. She was settling the debt, not just financial maybe, but something unspoken. Like that final wire was her way of saying, you win. Or maybe, I remember, or even, I know you didn't forget. Whatever it meant, it didn't need a reply. I opened my finance portal, created a new sub-fund, and named it something simple. Aegis, protection, distance, a small future that belonged to no one but me. I routed the $8,000 there, flagged it as locked, no withdrawals unless manually authorized by me at my local branch, in person. Not because I needed the money, but because it deserved to sit untouched. A placeholder for something better, not grand, not dramatic, and just something honest. Maybe a project I'd put off, a trip I hadn't taken, something I could touch without flinching. For years, I thought closure would come through explanation, apologies, understanding, but this was cleaner. No apology, no confession, just the final tether, cut, and that was the part she never understood. I didn't need to burn her new life to the ground. I just needed to make sure mine no longer stood in its shadow.